Before we start, I have to report a violation of church protocol and church rules. I hate to be a tattletale, but something has to be done. You have a sign by the road that says no fishing, and when we were leaving last week, we saw someone fishing. And he caught a fish while we were watching. I looked it up when we got home, and this is a little blue heron. That's its real name. I've been around water birds all my life, and I have never seen a little blue heron. I didn't even know there was such a thing. So I suggest to you today that you make the little blue heron your official church bird. And then when I come to church, I can wear my hat. Okay. Here is the big blue heron. That is our boat in Michigan. 36 years old this year and still going strong. So, welcome to our Bible study, our journey with Jesus. Last week, we did in fact just get started. We had to pack our bags with all sorts of background information and make plans for where we're going to go, but today we're actually going to hit the road. Jesus came down from the mountain of transfiguration, and the Bible tells us he set his face toward Jerusalem. And this was no vacation. This was no pleasure trip. In fact, the first thing Jesus says after the transfiguration story is, listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. But they did not understand what he meant. And that, of course, is surprising, kind of difficult for us to understand, because all the way back to the very beginning, on their first trip to Jerusalem in John chapter 2, right after Jesus had been baptized, he chased the money changers out of the temple. Now he's going to do it again on Monday, the day after Palm Sunday. It's no wonder that the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem were out to get Jesus, and he knew it. But he went anyway. He set his face toward Jerusalem, and we're going with him. So first of all, let's get out our map and find out where we're going. We know the transfiguration took place on a high mountain, which would be way up, as far as Jesus ever went from home, way up in the northern side of the Sea of Galilee. If you listen to the news and all of the conflict between Israelis and Syrians and Palestinians and all that, we think the transfiguration took place on what they call the Golan Heights, which is also happens to be where they unfortunately have to fight a lot of battles in these wars. And he's going to go from way up there to way down here to Jerusalem. It's a distance of about 80 miles. And Jesus and his friends actually made that trip often. They did not have interstates, of course, but they did have a road, actually a path to follow that would do two things. They would follow the path down here on this side of the river. That would keep them on level ground, and they could avoid Samaria. And even today, a lot of people are willing to go out of their way to avoid having to drive through a bad neighborhood. And as far as the Jews were concerned, Samaria was a bad neighborhood. So they would follow down the east bank of the river and make that journey. They walked. And if you were in good health, a journey like this would take 4 or 5 days. So, why did it take Jesus 6 months? Well, it was going to be 6 months from Transfiguration in the fall to Palm Sunday and Passover in the spring. In the meantime, Jesus would visit Jerusalem occasionally, actually 3 times. Jesus would come to Jerusalem during this 6 months that we call the journey. And actually, right after the Transfiguration, Jesus did go directly to Jerusalem. It was for one of the great Jewish festivals, the Festival of Tabernacles. Now, most of us are familiar with 2 of the 3 great Jewish festivals. Passover, of course, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter all took place because it was Passover. The date for Easter changes every year because the date for Passover changes. First full moon after the first day of spring. The second great Jewish festival was Pentecost. Now, we think of Pentecost as the birthday of the church. But Pentecost was already on the calendar as a Jewish festival. That's why all of those people from all over the world were in Jerusalem for that day that we call Pentecost, and that wonderful scripture reading, which is like a map of the world at that time. They were there because they were Jews and because it was Pentecost. It was their harvest festival, the end of the winter rainy season, very close to what we would call our Thanksgiving. It was the end of the 7th week after Passover, 49 days. So that Sunday would be the 50th day after Easter, and that's when we celebrate Pentecost. Tabernacles was the third great Jewish festival. A fall harvest festival, always took place in what we call October, and that's why we know that Transfiguration took place in the fall, because Jesus went right from Transfiguration to Jerusalem for the Festival of Tabernacles. Sometimes it was called the Festival of Booths, sometimes the Festival of Tents. You get the idea. The festival lasted 8 days. And during that time, people coming to Jerusalem would stay in temporary shelters as a reminder of the 40 years that their ancestors had wandered in the wilderness with Moses. Even the original tabernacle was a very portable tent. And since you are temporarily worshiping in a synagogue, you might be interested in that picture. That is a modern day Festival of Tabernacles shelter. We don't know where Jesus stayed in Jerusalem or what kind of shelter he might have erected. It wasn't important. What was important was that Jesus would spend every waking minute while he was in Jerusalem in the temple for several days. And that constant back and forth between him and the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders and the scribes all created this friction, this tension, to a point where the Jewish leaders were willing to kill Jesus at any moment. And at this point, and it's still 6 months before Palm Sunday, but at this point, we're going to introduce this movie to you. We're only going to watch a couple of minutes today, twice, but we will tell you about the movie because if you have access to the internet, you can watch it at home. The movie is simply called The Gospel of John. You can find it on the internet free if you have YouTube. And on YouTube, this is what it would look like. And they call it The Life of Jesus, but it's based entirely on the Gospel of John. It's similar to other movies like Jesus of Nazareth or The Chosen. But the narrator in this movie, Christopher Plummer, the narrator in this movie is reading the Gospel of John word for word. The only words the actors speak are when the Gospel quotes what they're saying word for word. The section that we're going to watch is the first 19 verses of John chapter 7, and it's printed for you on the handout. The handout is the NIV, the New International Version. It's not the same one that they used for the movie, but you can follow along and watch. This is the Gospel of John.
After this, Jesus traveled in Galilee. He did not want to travel in Judea because the Jewish authorities there were wanting to kill him. The time for the festival of shelters was near, so Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave this place and go to Judea, so that your followers will see the things that you're doing."
People don't hide what they're doing if they want to be well known. Since you are doing these things, let the whole world know about you.
Not even his brothers believed in him.
The right time for me has not yet come. Any time is right for you. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I keep telling it that its ways are bad. You go on to the festival. I am not going to this festival, because the right time has not come for me.
He said this and then stayed on in Galilee. After his brothers had gone to the festival, Jesus also went. However, he did not go openly, but secretly. The Jewish authorities were looking for him at the festival. "Where is he?" they asked. There was much whispering about him in the crowd. "He is a good man," some people said. "No," others said, "he fools the people." But no one talked about him openly, because they were afraid of the Jewish authorities. The festival was nearly half over when Jesus went to the temple and began teaching. The Jewish authorities were greatly surprised.
How does this man know so much when he's never been to school?
What I teach is not my own teaching, but it comes from God who sent me. Whoever is willing to do what God wants will know whether what I teach comes from God, or whether I speak on my own authority. Those who speak on their own authority are trying to gain glory for themselves. But he who wants glory for the one who sent him is honest, and there is nothing false in him.
We're going to come back to the movie in a little while, but let's go back to Jesus and the journey. It starts out with, after this was the Transfiguration. And what is interesting to a lot of people about this section, and this rather long section in John's Gospel, this journey to Jerusalem, first one after Transfiguration, the disciples are not mentioned. John refers to the brothers of Jesus. And any time the Bible mentions brothers, this causes all sorts of speculation as to whether or not Mary had any other children, which is a huge problem in the Catholic Church. The King James Version uses the word brethren. And we're not going to go into the Greek and all of that today. You could do that some other time with Pastor Gore. Interesting to say to me, because of course I'm always looking at this from the standpoint of when John wrote this and why he wrote it, and he knew that the church already had Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I think John is saying, hey, it wasn't us. We were the disciples. But this is a critically important moment in the life of Jesus, and yet we don't know where the disciples were. The festival lasted for several days. Jesus got there late, but he stayed in Jerusalem. In fact, all of John, chapters 7, 8, 9, and most of 10 took place during this 1 week or so that Jesus would spend in Jerusalem. That's why I call this the week that we know nothing about, most of us. There is no series of gospel readings to be read on Sundays in church from these 4 chapters. 4 chapters are too long to read in any one Sunday. So if what people know about the Bible is what they've heard read in church on Sundays, you don't know very much about this really extraordinary week in Jesus' life. We'll look at some of the main events. You can read all 4 chapters at home, and you could even watch the movie on YouTube if you get the chance. First, there were the daily confrontations with the Pharisees and Jewish leaders in the temple. Even Nicodemus, who Jesus was talking to in John chapter 3, John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Jesus was talking to Nicodemus, and Nicodemus gets involved. He shows up again here in chapter 7 at verse 50, when he's reminding the Pharisees they cannot condemn Jesus without a trial. And keep in mind, this is still 6 full months before Good Friday. The second thing that happened that week was the woman who had been caught in adultery. She was brought before Jesus in the hope that he would make an error in judgment, in the interpretation of the law. And one of the familiar verses from the Bible, even though most people have no idea where it came from or why Jesus said it, but Jesus says, "Let him that has no sin cast the first stone." And they let the woman go. And then there is the story of the blind man. In John's gospel, John does not, give us a list of miracle after miracle after miracle after parable after miracle, parable, miracle, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John only talks about a few of the miracles that Jesus did. But when he picks out a miracle to write about, he turns it into a story. And that's what we're going to watch today. The story of the blind man takes up the entire 9th chapter in the movie. I didn't have room to print the whole chapter on your handout, but you can follow along. I think, my opinion, for what it's worth, I think this is the best part of the movie, the story of Jesus and the blind man.
As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been born blind.
Teacher, whose sin caused him to be born blind? Was it his own or his parents' sin?
His blindness has nothing to do with his sins or his parents' sins. He is blind so that God's power might be seen at work in him. As long as it is day, he must keep on doing the work of him who sent me. Night is coming, when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light for the world.
After he said this, Jesus spat on the ground and made some mud with the spittle. He rubbed the mud on the man's eyes.
Go and wash your face in the pool of Siloam.
This name means sent. So the man went, washed his face, and came back, seeing. His neighbors then, and the people who had seen him begging before this, asked, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?"
He's the one. No, he isn't. He just looks like him. I am the man. How is it that you can now see? The man called Jesus made some mud, rubbed it on my eyes, and told me to go to Siloam and wash my face. So I went. And as soon as I washed, I could see. Where is he? I don't know.
Then they took to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. The day that Jesus made the mud and cured him of his blindness was a Sabbath. The Pharisees then asked the man again how he had received his sight.
He put some mud on my eyes. I washed my face, and now I can see.
The man who did this cannot be from God, for he does not obey the Sabbath law. How could a man who is a sinner perform such miracles as these?
And there was division among them.
You say he cured you of your blindness. Well, what do you say about him?
He is a prophet.
The Jewish authorities, however, were not willing to believe that he had been blind and could now see until they called his parents.
Is this your son? You say that he was born blind. How is it then that he can now see?
We know that he is our son, and we know that he was born blind. But we don't know how it is that he is now able to see, nor do we know who cured him of his blindness.
Ask him. He is old enough and he can answer for himself.
His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish authorities, who had already agreed that anyone who said he believed that Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That is why his parents said, "He is old enough, ask him." A second time, they called back the man who had been born blind.
Promise before God that you will tell the truth. We know that this man who cured you is a sinner.
I do not know if he is a sinner or not. One thing I do know. I was blind, and now I see.
What did he do to you? How did he cure you of your blindness?
I have already told you, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Maybe you too would like to be his disciples.
They insulted him and said,
You are that fellow's disciple. But we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for that fellow, however, we do not even know where he comes from.
What a strange thing that is. You do not know where he comes from, but he cured me of my blindness. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He does listen to people who respect him and do what he wants them to do. Since the beginning of the world, nobody has ever heard of anyone giving sight to a person born blind. Unless this man came from God, he would not be able to do a thing.
You were born and brought up in sin! And you are trying to teach us.
and they expelled him from the synagogue. When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man.
Do you believe in the Son of Man?
Tell me who he is, sir, so that I can believe in him.
You have already seen him. And he is the one who is talking with you now.
I believe, Lord.
And he knelt down before Jesus.
I came to this world to judge, so that the blind should see, and those who see should become blind.
Okay, that's where we will stop today, and might be able to squeeze in a few other clips from John in the weeks ahead. John goes into great detail, of course, in the story because, again, to show the friction between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, which really takes up the rest of the story of Jesus' life. We'll stop here today. We'll pick it up right here again next week. Maybe in the meantime, you can read these chapters in your Bibles at home. And next week, I'll take time to answer any questions that you might have.